All right. So the purpose, just to go all the way back, and this is the top of your notes, is the purposes of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles is, first off, it is proven history. They keep finding stuff in the ground, and that just proves this is history, and this is how everything works itself out. It's going in a historical manner. God could just say, I made Saul king, and then I made David king, but that, and even though that's accurate, it would not be the historical account of how those things actually work themselves out. And so going through the pains of reading the history gives you a reminder that God works his plans out in actual history, which means he's still working in our lives today. Secondly, it's an example to the church. So texts like Romans 15:4, which I should have had ready here. I didn't, but 15:4. For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through the perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. So God gave us the Bible and gave us all the earlier stuff, which in this case is all of the Bible now, but particularly in this context, the Old Testament, so that we would persevere in faith and we would be encouraged and that we would have hope. We can learn from both the positive and negative examples that are given to us. And just like 1 Corinthians 10, Paul writes when he's talking about the Israelites in the wilderness, he says these things happened as examples for us so that we would not crave evil things as they craved. So we have to look at the bad examples to say, don't do that. And then verse 11, also in 1 Corinthians 10, these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction. Okay, so it's hard to get around that the Old Testament was written both for the Israelites back then, but it was also written for the church age, that we might learn from it, and we should. Luke 24 also tells us that the whole thing points to Jesus. That doesn't mean that Jesus is in every text. That doesn't mean there is a type of Jesus in every text. But it does mean that everything is headed in that direction. That's what Jesus was saying in Luke 24, that as he opened up the Old Testament to those he was teaching, his disciples, that they all talk about him, meaning it's all pointing in that direction. And so as we're going along, we can find things because the New Testament shows us that this is about Jesus, but ultimately it's getting that direction whether or not he is mentioned in each and every text. And then finally, it's a reminder that God is sovereign. Job 42:2 says, this is Job talking, I know that you, God, can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. It can't be changed. God is doing everything according to plan. And this even came up this comes up in Genesis 18, where Abraham says, is anything too difficult for Yahweh? And the implication there is, of course not. And so he's going to do what he chooses to do, the way he's going to do it, and that is what this history is. It keeps showing that God is in charge and that he will continue to be in charge all the way through, whether or not the Israelites are obedient or disobedient, whether you have good kings or bad kings. God's plan is working itself out perfectly, and it is always on schedule, which again gives us lots of encouragement and hope, because that means no matter what is going on in our current world, no matter what's going on in our current personal life, God is always directing everything according to his purpose. Now, of course, blessing comes when we're obedient, but it's all headed that direction. And the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles point us that way. All right, as for getting all the way to where we're at in 2 Chronicles, so just sort of a summary of everything with all the cute little pictures that I have up there, I think it's the next slide. There you go. Yep, it is. Genesis 1 through 11 is creation, the fall, the flood comes. We have the first covenant through Noah. We have then the nations that arrive. From the nations, God then pulls out one particular man, and that is Abraham. And he gives him a covenant, a promise that is everlasting, that is unilateral for God. It's unconditional for Abraham and his descendants. And it's given, and it's three provisions, namely land, seed, that is a lineage, and blessing to all families. And those three things are how the Abrahamic covenant is going to work themselves out. And even though we don't see them fulfilled now, and they've yet to be fulfilled, that means God is still going to bring them about. He is going to give the land he laid out for them in the Old Testament. He has given a seed to be for national blessing, but there will be a national Israel, and the blessing to all the families of the world, which has not happened yet. They have not been a blessing, but one day they will be. And that the Abrahamic covenant is repeated in chapter 12, 15, 17, 21, 25, and it just keeps on rolling all the way through there. Very important. From Exodus to Deuteronomy, the Hebrews go into slavery. God rescues them. God then takes them to Mount Sinai to give them his law. There we see the Mosaic covenant come into play. And this is a temporary covenant. We know that because Christ said it was ended in him. It is a bilateral and conditional for Israel, meaning that there's something, if they would do certain things, then God would do certain things. In this case, if they obey God's law, God would bless them. If they disobey his law, he would receive curses. The other thing that Brandon and Harrison and myself were looking at this morning is being reminded that as Israel is a holy nation, that they will be a blessing to the nations. When they are not being holy, they are a curse to the nations, and really the nations come and curse them as they look at as they start following their gods. And so they're supposed to be a blessing to everybody. That's really the point, and they can't do that unless they are holy. Again, the provisions that are given in the Mosaic covenant are peace and prosperity in the land. But if they're disobedient, then there will be conflict and scarcity in the land. And so we operate on those two things. God is going to bless the nation of Israel, but he's going to curse them. That doesn't mean he gets rid of the Abrahamic covenant, but he will curse them, and he will bring the massive conflict and problems into the land if they do not obey his law. And that's what we function ourselves on while we read through the history. The first generation rejects God in Judges, in the wilderness. God replaces them with the second generation. The book of Joshua comes along, and Moses reiterates the whole of the law in Deuteronomy. That's the point of Deuteronomy. Israel enters the promised land with Joshua. They conquer it, or most of it. They divide it, but then they descend right back into sinful cycles. That's the book of Judges. God rescues them regularly with those chosen judges. But we find out when they get to the end of Judges that there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, meaning we probably need a king, and we need to stop doing what's right in our own eyes and do what's right in God's eyes. 1 Samuel then becomes a transition book from a theocracy, which is where God rules, to a monarchy where God rules through kings. So again, it's very important. God is the one that's still in charge. God is the one that's going to be ruling. He's just going to do it through humanity. And he's going to do it, in this case, through a monarchy. So a new chapter comes in. And so when we look at sort of the summary of 1 Samuel, which should be the next slide, I think, then you can go to the next one. There you go. And we looked at all this last semester, so hopefully you remember a lot of it, but this is basically the whole new chapter of what's going on. We have Samuel and his early life, meaning God plans to bless even though Israel is in disobedience. We see that Israel was trying to use the ark as sort of a talisman, a rabbit's foot, a lucky charm. They weren't really trusting God. They were trusting in a piece of furniture to save them, and that was not what that piece of furniture was for. And so it got taken away from them to remind them, and God brought it back to them. So it was all God in charge of the ark traveling, and he was also cursing the Philistines while he was at it. Well, they really want a king, but they don't want a king the way God said they're going to give a king, as he mentions in Deuteronomy 17. They reject God, and it's never a good idea to do that, but God says, okay, go ahead, choose for yourself somebody, or you want somebody that's like that, fine. Here's King Saul. He seems to start out okay, but by the time we get to chapter 13, Saul is just a massive failure. And from that time on, he had 2 years of decent reigning, and then the next 38 years of his reigning was just a downward spiral away from God. And so the crown got taken away from him. Meanwhile, God sends Samuel to go out to Bethlehem to anoint this scrawny little kid who's good looking. He was ruddy and handsome and all that. But this shepherd boy, and they anoint him. And David is supposed to be then the king. He ends up with Saul being his main musician, personal musician. But Saul hates him and wants to kill him, and so David ends up on the run. He spends his 20s, when he was in his 20s, running from Saul. And he does good sometimes. He does not so good some other times. But he's trusting God through all of these valleys. In that time, somewhere, God makes a promise that he will give an everlasting promise to David for a throne. We just don't know where that happened exactly. Then Saul dies, very, very simply. Saul has to end at some point, and God is the one who does it by Saul's own sword. Jonathan is killed, as well as the other sons. Abinadab, Melchishua is also killed, his other sons. And so we just have the end. And it really ends 1 Samuel on a really tragic spot. There's dead leadership. The enemy has won. Israel is a sheep without shepherd. Their only king that they chose for themselves is a massive failure, and Israel itself has only itself to blame. Again, we have just bad leadership from chapters 1 to 4 in Eli. We have the rejection of God and his prophet in chapters 8 and 12. And then you have the deterioration of Saul, the royalty, in chapters 13 through 31. In that way, it's just not a very fun book. It's just sort of depressing as you keep going. There's not a lot to be excited about at the end of 1 Samuel. It's one mess after another. It's pretty abysmal. Thankfully, that view is not the final view. And oftentimes, if you stop there, you think, well, what left is there? And we need to remember God is orchestrating his unwavering plan, and he will override the evil schemes. But everything now turns to David. What will David do next? What is God's plan to get David on the throne? And this is where we come to 2 Samuel. As a whole, 2 Samuel is another reminder of God's sovereign control to put David on the throne and to make promises to Israel concerning an everlasting kingdom through a son of David. Okay? So the goal is to get David on the throne and to get him an everlasting covenant, which will be eventually for his descendant. And that will not be for David. Again, this is not David we're talking about. David, as we'll see, and we've already seen a little bit, is a deeply flawed man. And yet the promise is made that God will bring forth a son of David to be king on earth, on David's throne in Jerusalem, who will rule over God's forever earthly kingdom. So the goal is to make initially David the king of Israel. But what's really interesting about this, you can go to the next slide, what's really interesting about this is that David, go to the next one after that, David doesn't become king until chapter 5. There's 4 chapters before this. He's crowned in chapter 2, immediately upon Saul's death, which is 1010 BC. But chapter 2 until chapter 5 is 7.5 years. What in the world? Why does it take so long to get David to the throne? Shouldn't he have taken over the moment Saul was dead, or at least in a very short period of time? Well, that's where the story in this history gets interesting. And here's where we see God's providential plan work itself out. All right, 2 Samuel 1. I'm going to say 1 Samuel a bunch, but I'm going to move eventually. 2 Samuel 1. I'll just call this David's respect for God's anointed. I think that's the next slide. Yeah, perfect. Hopefully you can see a map back there, map-ish. Oh, cool. Okay. So, you'll remember the sons were slain, Saul's sons were slain by the Philistines. Saul was struck by an arrow, knowing his time has come. He asked the armor bearer to kill him. The armor bearer refused. Saul falls on his own sword. The armor bearer kills himself as well. Then, beginning right at the front side of 2 Samuel, an Amalekite man decides he has a good plan to get in good with the new king, and he travels 80 miles with this plan from Mount Gilboa, which is up in the north, all the way down to where David is at in Ziklag. And what he does is he works out a big old fat lie, thinking this will sway David. Look at chapter 1, verse 6. We'll cut right to the chase here. And the young man told him, said, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and behold, Saul was leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen pursued him closely. Then he turned to look behind him, and he saw me, and called to me, and said, here I am. And he said to me, who are you? And I answered him, I'm an Amalekite. Then he said to me, please stand by me and put me to death, for agony has seized me, because my life lingers in me. So I stood beside him and put him to death, because I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown which was on his head and the bracelet which was on his arm, and I brought it to you here, my Lord. What a fantastical little story. It's not true. David doesn't know that, though. It seems David here has no choice but to believe this man, because we didn't have, Twitter and Facebook and all that. But I think it is possible that David discerned a lie here. First, why would Saul be without any armor bearer or an armed escort? Why was he all by himself? Second, how did this Amalekite get through this supposed really intense battle that was going around Saul when they were particularly bearing down on Saul? This seems like a very strange happening. But either way, David makes no issue with this. The man will not be judged based upon the actual lie that he told. Rather, he bases his judgment in the fact that he murdered God's anointed. So look at verse 14. Then David said to him, how is it that you were not afraid to send forth your hand to destroy the anointed of Yahweh? Talking about Saul. And David called one of the young men and said, approach and fall on him. So he struck him and he died. And David said to him, your blood is on your head, for your mouth has answered against you, saying, I have put the anointed of Yahweh to death. So this man was guilty of a lie, but murder was the reason that he was slain. The point is, the man was judged for his lack of honor toward Yahweh in not honoring God's anointed, whether that be Saul or David. This man only thought of himself, no doubt seeking accolades from David for doing such a, quote, noble thing. If there's no loyalty to God's anointed, there is no respect for God. Also note that David has continued loyalty for God's way, and therefore God's anointed. Remember, he had 2 chances to kill Saul, and he did not. And his loyalty even extends at death, for David does not tolerate this action in others as well. I'm not going to kill God's anointed, and you better not either. The Amalekite figured David was hungry for power, again, like the nations, or even like Saul, who was hungry for power. But verse 14, David was very afraid of crossing God, and that's exactly how a godly person functions. Godly fear controls us to honor and obey God. And this is an important narrative point. David receives the throne of Israel with integrity. There's no foul play in David because, number one, he was dozens of miles away from Saul, and so he did not participate in the death of Saul. And secondly, his response to Saul's death is remorse, not rejoicing. He genuinely loved Saul and Jonathan, and his life bore that out. Now, on the backside of this then, beginning in verse 17, David, like many people do today, process difficulty. Well, sometimes we do it with praise too, but process difficulty through music, through poetry, through art. In this case, a song. And so he wrote a song called the Song of the Bow in verse 18. Again, why is it called that? Possibly because Saul got hit with an arrow, but not really sure. And the theme of this, because it's repeated 3 times, the theme of this is how the mighty have fallen. You can see it in verse 19, how the mighty have fallen. Verse 25, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. And in 27, how the mighty have fallen. Just kind of go through it really very, very quickly, and then I'll just make a quick application, then we've got to move on. But verse 19 is the intro. Saul and Jonathan were the beauty and glory of Israel as they were the highest royals in the land. So David's giving them honor. Verse 20, there's a rebuke to the enemy for their rejoicing. Verse 21, I guess that could have been verse 1. You had an intro in verse 19. Verse 20 is verse 1 in the song. Verse 2 in the song, which is verse 21 in our Bibles, addresses the mount where these men died, calling down a poetic curse upon that mountain. Verses 22 and 23 is verse 3 in the song. Saul and Jonathan's courage and commitment to each other in life and death, David remembers. They were intimately connected as father and son, and commander-in-chief and his commander. Verse 24, which would be verse 4 in the song, call for the wailers, those who wail, to cry out about Saul's death. Again, showing that his love for Saul and that he didn't, even though he was pursued by Saul to be killed, he really didn't have any animosity toward Saul. And then verses 25 and 26, which is verse 5 of the song, David's personal lament for Jonathan. He gives it 2 verses because he loved Jonathan dearly as a brother. And the more we love, the more we grieve. Verse 27 is the conclusion of the song, how the mighty have fallen. I want to read a kind of a lengthy quote from Dale Ross Davis's book. It's very good because I think we struggle in our culture with lament. We struggle with grief. We struggle with losing things, and we don't know how to express them. And Dale Ralph Davis gives a really helpful thought on this, as well as, I didn't bring the book, as well as a guy by the name of Mark Vragrop. He wrote a book called Dark Clouds and Deep Mercy. And it's a whole book on just biblical lament. It's very, 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 very good. And I just want to apply these things real quick with David's lament here, because like I said, it feels weird to us. We don't know what to do with lament. We think we're just supposed to get over it. And then the people who can't get over it think they're weird because everybody else is getting over it, but we're not getting over it. And the answer to that is that there is a biblical way to go about lamenting. And David gives that here, and a lot of other Psalms help us out with that as well. But let me just read this quote, and then it will be very helpful. Daroff Davis. A lament is a formal expression of grief or distress, one that can be written, read, learned, practiced, repeated. A lament differs from the informal, spontaneous, immediate outbursts of grief, like those in verses 11 and 12 of chapter 1. A lament is no less sorrowful or sincere, but it is a vehicle for the mind as well as for the emotions. A lament is an expression of thoughtful grief. In a written lament, then, words cannot be simply dumped or gushed or mushed into initial grief. Here, one cannot simply vomit out feelings, but must choose words. Not that the lament is cold or objective or detached. Rather, the intensity of one's emotions unite with the discipline of one's mind to produce structured sorrow, a sort of authorized version of distress, a kind of coherent agony. In a lament, therefore, words are carefully selected, crafted, honed to express loss as closely yet fully as possible. I wonder if there is a principle here for all Yahweh's people when they lose, especially Christian friends or loved ones. Along with our emotional grief, should we not also express our reflective grief? Why not write down our grief in careful, thoughtful lament form and offer it up to God as such, and then do so again and again? The sorrows and wounds God's people receive from their losses are not miraculously healed after a short time of emotional catharsis. And sometimes in the church, there is such an impatience with grief. But the lament form of the Bible assumes that our grief is deep and ongoing, and it invites us to enter the discipline of expressing that grief in words that convey our anguish, in images that picture our despair, in written prayers that verbalize despondency. Why should God's people be shoddy in their sorrow? End quote. It's very good. We should be good, or we should try to write down with poetic words distress and sorrow, and then offer that to God. In Mark Vragerop's book, Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, he does a whole study in biblical lament. And he states in his book that lament is a prayer in pain that leads to trust, the path from heartbreak to hope, a poetic odyssey with 4 elements. And I have these back there. Number 1, there's an address to God, which Weigrup calls to turn to God. Second, a complaint. Third, a request. And finally, an expression of trust and praise. So, turn, complain, ask, trust. The heart is turned to God in prayer. The complaint clearly and bluntly lays out the reasons behind the sorrow that we feel. And from there, make a request for God to act, do something. And then finally, nearly every single lament ends with renewed trust and praise. So, my point of doing all that is that we need to not be quick to get out of lament. Our culture doesn't like it, but God invites it. We live in a fallen world. And lament is the way God has made for us to get us to stop looking at ourselves for answers and instead look to Him. Look to His promises. Look to His plans. Look to His future. Those things give us what we need in lament, and that is hope. If you run past lament or shove it away, then you'll just find that despair remains and hope never arrives. So let's take the example that David has given to us in the loss of these two men that he had, specifically Jonathan, and learn how to lament biblically. All right. So David should be anointed, right? And then we're good to go. No, because I told you, we don't get anointed, we don't actually become the king until chapter 5. So, we get into chapter 2 now. And we have what I'm calling a kingdom divided initially. And the summary here is that Judah anoints David, while Israel in the north anoints Ishbosheth. And there's war between them. So David begins with seeking out God's counsel to become king. I love this. Look at the first verse here. This is cool. Of chapter 2. Now it happened afterwards that David asked of Yahweh. This is very good. This is exactly what Saul was not doing, but David's doing it. He asked of Yahweh, saying, shall I go up to one of the cities of Judah? Because remember, he's in Ziklag. And Yahweh said to him, go up. And David said, where shall I go up? And he said, go to Hebron. Okay, so there's our little map up there. We are still south of Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which will come around to it. And again, this is the opposite of Saul, who acted first and then tried to apologize later. But the key is a king of Israel was not to act independently from God, but was to cooperate with the priest, who was in direct contact with God, and the prophets. Saul rejected all of that. David is doing this right. Should I move, God? Yes, go to Hebron. You got it. And they move. Verse 4, then the men of Judah came and there anointed David king over the house of Judah. So again, very smooth right now. David was to be king of all Israel. We know that all the way back in 1 Samuel 13, 15, 16. So how does this all happen? What's really interesting here, and that's really fun, is that David begins with a little bit of wisdom work that is wise. Beginning at the end of verse 4, it says, and they told David, saying, it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul. And then David sent messengers to Jabesh Gilead. Do you remember where Jabesh Gilead is? You see it up there? If you come down, it's on this side. Is that in the south or in the north? Do you guys see Jabesh Gilead up there? It's under Beth Shan. Is it north or south? It is in the north. Okay, this is Ishbosheth land now. And yet David found out that these men buried Saul in 1 Samuel 31. And so he expresses, verse 5, gratitude to them and makes a proposal to them for the Jabesh Gileadites to come down and transfer their loyalty from Saul's line to David's line. It would be natural for them to just be loyal to, in this case, Ishbosheth. But David is trying to ask them, which is interesting because, remember, he's anointed the king of Israel now. So he could demand that they come down, but instead he is asking them and being kind to them and not demanding. The question is, what do they do? And the answer is, we don't know. Because it ends at verse 7 and then verse 8 immediately. Now Abner, the son of Ner, what a great dad's name to have, Ner, commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him to Mahanaim, and he made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel and Ephraim and Benjamin, even over all Israel. So we have no idea what happened to Jabesh Gilead. They just Abner just made Ishbosheth king single-handedly. Ishbosheth, by the way, was the youngest of Saul's son. He's the only surviving son. His name means literally man, Ish, of shame, Bosheth of shame. He's a man of shame, which probably means he's a coward, is kind of how it would translate out. And that gives you a hint on why he's possibly the only living son left of Saul. All his other sons were bravely fighting in battle. Ishbosheth was nowhere near the fight because he was a man of shame. In 1 Chronicles 8 and 9, Ishbosheth's name is Eshbaal, meaning man of Baal, showing how far Saul had fallen because Saul had named Ishbosheth after one of the false gods of the nations. That's how far Saul went. The point is, Abner was the ambitious one here. Ishbosheth was nobody's first choice to be king, and he is more or less a puppet. And this would last, verse 10, 2 years. By the way, just for a little trivia for all of you guys, who was the second king of Israel? Most would say David. The actual answer is Ishbosheth was the second king of Israel. He just was there for a very short period of time. Shouldn't have been, but he was. And there you go. Now, this sets up the conflict of the chapter. David is the rightful king, but the king of Israel is still there. How do we get rid of this Ishbosheth dude? And though he's not anointed by God, and there's where your argument of saying he's really not the second king, because David is, because he's anointed. But how do we get rid of this guy? David's not one of those murdering type kind of individuals. So what do we do? And this is a reminder that the path that leads to the fulfillment of God's promises is rarely ever smooth. God makes a promise, and sometimes that promise comes about in very, very rough ways. There's always obstacles. There always seems to be opposition. The promises of God are true. We can look forward to their fulfillment with absolute certainty, but the path to get there is seldom as simple as jump from A to B. One commentator about this said, even with Saul out of the way, there is still ambitious Abners and insurgent Ishbosheths to deal with. There will always be opposition, even religious opposition within the camp. But not following the anointed one of God is rebellion to God. Following Ishbosheth is rebellion. What's interesting is even Saul knew that. 1 Samuel 20, 23, and 24, Saul knew David was the anointed one, and yet he kept on doing his own thing, trying to kill the anointed. The point is we must follow God's anointed and no one else. In this case, it would ultimately be Christ. To not follow Christ is to be in open rebellion to God. It's also important to remember, sort of kingdom perspective, the small eventually becomes the dominant or the worldwide. We know this from Daniel 2. You know this, but I'll repeat it to you. Daniel 2:34. You continued looking until a stone was cut out with hands, and it struck the image on its feet and its iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron and clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. Talking about all the kingdoms before the kingdom, which again was just a stone. And that stone struck the image, became a great mountain, and that mountain filled the earth. In other words, just because it looks like evil is winning and the popular is overriding what is holy, it does not mean that you need to embrace it, because what looks small and weak is actually going to reign over all. Well, we know this is not going to go well for Abner and Ish because, again, they're in rebellion to God. We already saw what happens when you do rebel, Saul. So here is the first wave of failure for Abner and the rise of David. And so a very simple overview of this next section, I'm going to go kind of quickly over. But from the middle of chapter 2 all the way through the end of chapter 3, you basically have Abner doing something and failing, doing something else and failing, doing one final thing and dying, which is the ultimate failure in this case. And that's how this section goes, because Abner and Ishbosheth cannot succeed because David is the anointed one. So very quickly through these. The first part is a military contest that ends poorly. That's the end of chapter 2. Abner and his men, this is interesting stuff. So this is where, if you think the Bible is boring, you got to read this section because this is the really fun sort of movie stuff. Abner and his men met Joab. Joab is David's commander. They and his men met by the pool of Gibeon, and they had a little contest, a little hand-to-hand combat, 12 on 12. Again, it was common sport in the ancient world among warring tribes to do battle this way. Our champion against your champion. That should sound really familiar with David and Goliath. And it's a winner take all. In this case, it's not just 1-on-1, but 12 on 12. So in verse 15, they choose 12 men. In verse 16, all 24 of them die. They all kill each other. So tie. And because each one of them seized the other person they were fighting against, and they both thrust each other's sword in each other's side, and they all fell down dead. So each person killed both people at the same time, all the way down the line. And that didn't end it. It just provoked everybody else, and a battle erupts. So in verse 17, Abner's men go after them, but they are defeated before David's men, and they are defeated very badly because in verse 30 and 31, we are given the death count. The death count in chapter 2, verse 30 and 31 is that David lost 19 men, while Abner lost 360 men. That is a whooping. Now, what's also important, in the middle of this skirmish that's going on, of all these guys fighting now, Joab's brother, Asahel, pursues Abner. Why? I'm not really sure. Abner sees him stalking him around, and he tells Asahel to stop following him or he will kill him. So it's like, a little brother following you around, stop following me or something bad will happen. Same idea. In this case, death threat. Well, he doesn't stop, and so Abner turns around and kills him. Okay? So Joab's brother is now dead at the hands of Abner. And that's a really important point for later on. Just keep that in mind. Joab's brother was killed by Abner. Okay? But the point at the end of chapter 2 is that Abner is losing very badly militarily. So, chapter 3, he's going to try a totally different tactic. Abner sees the inevitable, and he's going to submit to David's rule. But that does not end well for him. Abner continues to fail militarily. They just talk about it real briefly in verse 1 of chapter 3. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David was long. David grew steadily stronger. The house of Saul grew weaker continually. It's an obvious point. We already know that was going to happen because David's the anointed king. He's going to win out in the end. It's very much like a superhero movie. I went and saw Superman. I know he's going to win. We just want to watch the movie to see how he does it. That's this, okay? I'm sorry to spoil it for you. Superman does win at the end of the movie. The proof of verse 1 is verses 2 through 5. How does David continue to get stronger? Well, the way he does that is this list of all of his children. How many more children does Saul have? Well, he's only got the one, Ishbosheth. He's got one kid. David is getting all these new kids. So his line, his family is getting stronger and stronger. In verses 6 through 11, a problem then arises between Ishbosheth and Abner. Ishbosheth accuses Abner of getting together with one of Ishbosheth's harem. So it was customary for a king to have a whole bunch of women at his disposal. That was called a harem. And that was a sign in the ancient world for power and wealth. Saul's harem, or a king's harem, if the king dies, would naturally go to the successor. In this case, Ishbosheth would now own all of King Saul's women. The reason that Ishbosheth is suspicious of Abner going after one or two of the harem is because, number one, Abner is very ambitious right now. And secondly, he thinks that by being with one of these women, that might usurp his right, Ishbosheth's right, to be king. Because Abner can say, well, these are my women, and therefore I'm the king, sort of thing. Abner says he has not done this. He's offended by such an accusation. The text never tells us if he actually did that or not. Abner goes into a really angry monologue in verses 8 through 11, which is a really interesting monologue because he notes in verses 9 and 10 and 18 that Yahweh has appointed David to be king. Isn't that crazy? Abner knows that David is the rightful anointed king of Israel. And yet he's doing everything he can up to this point to make sure that Ishbosheth is the king of Israel. I mean, sin, again, just makes you stupid. It's dumb. It's blind. But that is Satan. That is what we do when we're in our sin. We deceive ourselves to honestly believe that we can thwart God's plans. It's ridiculous. So Abner needs to abandon his plan of Ishbosheth because it's not working. And so he leaves Ishbosheth and he goes down to David in verse 12. And again, this is not out of love for God, but out of politics, if you'd like. And he wants to save his own skin to be on the winning side. And just as maybe brief application here, we all need to be very aware of our hearts that seek the Lord purely for selfish gain. I do it because, well, it is the best way, and I get lots of friends out of it, and I stay away from evil things and out of jail, and I don't get mixed up with the wrong crowd, and I don't do other things other people do. That's all selfish motive. Those things are right, but that's for selfish gain. Abner just wants to be on the winning side, rather than going to God's anointed because he loves God and God is worthy of such things. Again, think of Judas. Judas was with Jesus for his own purposes, for his own selfish gain. And ultimately he rejected him. Well, David welcomed Abner because David is a good guy here. But he only welcomed under the condition that he bring his first wife back, Michal. Remember Michal? Abner did this. They had a big feast, and then David sent him away in peace to go gather all of Israel and bring them to him. And this is where Abner fails, is that David, when he made this request to Abner, what he actually says is that go ask Ishbosheth to do this. So David will not allow Abner to be like the supposed king, but rather that he will still go through the rightful channels. That's integrity. He's not making secret deals outside of who is the king currently in Israel. As a side note to the whole Michal thing, Saul had Michal remarry a guy named Paltiel, and in my opinion, and you can disagree if you'd like, I think it was, first off, bad that Saul took Michal away from David and forced the marriage with this man. but it was a marriage that should have been honored by David. So we have a chink in his armor where he's taking away a wife that, yes, was his at some point, but weird circumstances that were basically out of his control forced this other marriage, and David should have respected that marriage and left it. Again, you can disagree with me if you'd like on that, but that's what I think should have happened. He already had a bunch of wives. We know that from verses 2 down through verse 5. So we have a big problem that's brewing in David. Now, in verse 23, Ishbosheth wasn't the only one who was suspicious of Abner and his ambition. Remember, Joab was the commander of David's army. He didn't like this. He chides David, says, "You're being gullible. This will never happen." Plus, remember that Joab has a beef against Abner because he killed his brother. And so after he rebukes David, then he just goes after Abner. And at the end of chapter 3, he just straight kills Abner. And this is very bad because this whole thing could have massively derailed the tribes of Israel to trust David. But David, being smart, he distanced himself from that quickly, very fast. And thankfully, the people figured out that David didn't have anything to do with Abner's death. It was just a personal vendetta on Joab's part. By doing that, by the way, by exposing Joab, the end of chapter 3 shows us that the people knew that it happened and that it endeared David to them even more. David also lamented at Abner's funeral, and he publicly shamed Joab for his evil deed. And so the chapter ends with good. David is now winning. This is awesome. And again, David's not looking for political points. He's genuine. He's trusting Yahweh's way. And he genuinely believed that Abner should not have died. Joab was doing things on his own, and he had to distance himself from that. But again, God is sovereign. That doesn't mean the ends justify the means. Even David knows that. But we do our part. We be gracious. We wait on God like David did. We mourn over evil. We hate evil. We call it out. We distance ourselves from evil actions. This is exactly what a godly man or woman does. So, sovereignly, there's really only one obstacle left, and that is Ishbosheth. How does Ishbosheth get out of the way? And that's where chapter 4 comes in. Chapter 4, where we have now the backbone of Israel's army, Abner, is dead, then all you have left is the man who's a coward. But Saul's dynasty is winding down. Everybody knows it. Ishbosheth has absolutely no courage, chapter 4, verse 1, to do anything. But a couple guys decide that they maybe can get in on the new administration with David. And so 2 other commanders, Banah, that's not short for banana, by the way, it's Banah, and Rechab, they decide that they're going to strike right at the heart of it. And so they go to Ishbosheth in the middle of the day while he's resting, and they kill him, Ishbosheth, and behead him. And then they thought it was a great idea to go down to David and try to win points. Look, David, we dispatched your enemy. Man, we could be really useful in your kingdom, right? And what's weird, look at this. Go chapter 4, verse 8. They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David to Hebron, said to him, "Behold, the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. Thus Yahweh has given my Lord, the king, vengeance this day as Saul and his seed." And David, and he goes, so basically what they're presenting themselves at is, hey, David, we are your redeemer. We redeemed you, David. And this is where we learn proper theology always leads to worship and right living before God, not sin and self-righteousness, is what these men did. You remember what happened to the Amalekite who tried to pull this off back in chapter 1? How do you think this is going to go? Not well. David calls them more wicked than the Amalekite because at least Saul died on a battlefield. David basically says, y'all killed Ishbosheth in his house while he was defenseless. You're all a bunch of cowards. And the point is, David fought against Ishbosheth, but never out of personal vengeance. Plus, David was against injustice. And the other point is the narrator is making clear that David is innocent of the death of all of Israel's leadership. Saul's death, Saul's sons, Abner's, and then finally Ishbosheth. His throne was not taken by force. God gave it even through a very messy way. And so we get to chapter 5 when they anoint David as king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king. He reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 over all Israel and Judah. David is now on the throne. Very messy, but providentially, God has got him on the throne. And we'll look at the rest of his kingship next week. A couple walkaways that are very helpful to us. First off, the importance of patience. You don't have to be anxious about what's coming, politics, a job, whatever you're out of control of. Wait on the Lord to be the mover and shaker. The Lord can move and shake with a lot more force than you and I can. God can remove obstacles and eliminate opposition without any assistance from you. Remember these chapters. No power, Abner, can overcome God's kingdom, chapter 2. No folly or deceptiveness, Abner and Joab, can overcome God's kingdom plans, chapter 3. And no injustice, the death of Ishbosheth, can thwart what God is doing. We need to be patient and let God do in His timing what He does. It's always best. Let us not be anxious. Secondly, the necessity of prayer to the Lord or inquiring. That's what David did. He prayed. He sought direction from God. That was David's life. Let's learn from that. And thirdly, the principle of not focusing, though this is really important, the principle of not being in the right position, but being the right person. We say to young men looking for a wife, don't focus on finding the right person, just focus on being the right person. If you're the right person, you will find the right person. If you're godly, you will attract godliness. If you are ungodly, you will attract ungodliness. You need to focus on being the right person. You may want that promotion at your job, but it's more important that you are righteous and holy in what you do. Let God take care of the promotion. It's true in so many areas of life. Be the right person. Positions, promotions, privileges will take care of themselves. So seek the Lord in all things. Serve where He puts you, whether that's great things or small things. Don't be manipulative and deceptive. Don't justify sin. Wait upon the Lord, because His way and His appointments and His timing are always best. Let's live by the example David has given us here. All right? And that is up through that point. Let me pray and commit these to the Lord, and then I went a little over. Well, that happens. All right. God, thank you for our time in your word, and pray you would help us to be men and women that would trust your timing of things. Seek your direction in your word and through your people who speak wisdom to us. Give us the necessary patience and grace we need to trust your way, your timing, knowing that what you do is always good. In Jesus' name, amen.